The bare rock mesa was now between them and the afternoon sun, rising darkly from the desert like the hull of some gigantic sailing vessel which had foundered in the dun-colored sea. Even to Richard's experienced gaze, the rows of houses lining the summit to the very edge of the cliff were indistinguishably a part of the color and substance of their remote setting. The mesa's rocky cap blended so perfectly with the low, uneven outline of the stone and adobe village that the deceptive mingling of the two was nearly perfect. Mesa and crowning Pueblo knit into one. Gradually, as they adjusted their eyes to the heights above, they could make out three distinct villages. Walpi, on the prow of the mesa, and, connected with Walpi by a narrow gap, the pueblos of Chicomovi and Hano. The faint throb of a drum was the only sound that came to them. Their first impression was that the entire mesa was deserted by all except the unseen drummer. But as they rode up the steep switchback trail leading to the summit, they caught sight of burros corralled in the rocks, naked Hopi children skittering in play among the ledges, and blanketed women moving intently along the web of foot trails. When they reached the top and turned into the narrow streets of Hano, Richard and his companions were met by the neutral gaze of Hopi eyes watching from doorways, windows, and rooftops. As they proceeded on to the plaza, however, a small band of children and dogs formed a procession in their wake. They sensed there was nothing unfriendly in this reception, and they were not regarded as unwelcome intruders. Richard and Clayton left the others in the plaza's baking sunlight and buzz of flies to inquire for a place to stay. A wizened old grandfather paused in his unloading of juniper branches from a burro to hear their questions. After a short palaver that was a mixture of gestures and a few words in Navajo and English, the old fellow limped off with a motion for them to follow. He led them back the way they had come to a house close to the head of the trail. His knock brought an immediate response, and he left him there with a short middle-aged man and his plump, smiling wife. From the dim interior, the wide-eyed, bashful gaze of several small children was fastened upon them, and while their host was giving smiling assurances of welcome, Richard could see the family's quarters, already crowded, hardly could take 5 more bedrolls. Bert Cowing explained how the problem was solved. The house was right on the top of the trail. It was very nice and clean, considering, but nonetheless we preferred to sleep outdoors on the rooftop. During several nights, and the wind blew pretty hard and blew considerable sand into our beds, we stayed at the house of a certain Tony Poloki, probably Polaka, the son of Hano's chief, who is known as one of the most progressive of the Mokis. He is the one who favors school and such modern institutions. Our landlady makes the best pottery in town, or in fact in any of the towns so far as I know. The description would fit the famous potter of the Tewan village of Hano, Nampeyo, who revived his degenerating art after she saw the number of superb prehistoric pots excavated from nearby Sikyati and other ruins, and used these as models. Besides setting other Hopi women to follow her example, Nampeyo made bowls and jars, which frequently found their ways into museum. In the morning after their arrival, Richard and the others explored the 3 villages. In the narrow passageways between the houses of Walpi, they heard occasionally the chants that came from the subterranean chambers of the Snake and Antelope clans. The Hopi villagers moved quietly about their affairs as though oblivious to the ceremony, which soon now, on the 9th day, would reach its culmination in the narrow open plaza. Every so often, a blanketed Snake clan priest would emerge from the skiva and hurry off on some mysterious errand, holding one corner of his blanket before his bowed head. Almost instinctively, the people of Walpi sensed his approach and turned their backs or averted their eyes so they would not observe his passage. During the next 3 days of waiting, the hours passed quickly for everyone except Muldoon Kelly, whose interest flagged after the first tour of the villages. Each evening they returned to the house of Tom Polke, carrying the few things they had purchased or bartered for that day. Under a tarpaulin against the sheltering wall, they amassed their growing collection, pieces of pottery chosen carefully in the 3 villages, but most of them from the home where they stayed. Kachinas, carved from cottonwood and brightly painted, representing the Hopi deities said to dwell among the peaks of the distant San Francisco Mountains. They collected belts, woven beautifully in designs of green, red, and black, and reminiscent of the fragments of weaving Richard had found in the caves of Butler Wash and Grand Gulch. Finely loomed blanket or 2 was bought, and a woman's dress of black-dyed wool, designed to be worn with the left shoulder bare and caught at the waist with one of the colorful belts. In the afternoon and evening before the final public ceremony, the villages of Walpi, Shmovo, and Hano became crowded with new arrivals, Hopi families from the mesas to the west and far as the Moenkopi, groups of Navajos who silently, proudly kept apart with themselves, and the scattering of white people, about 70 in all, traders, government men, and ranchers for the most part, but also a few tourists who had braved the trip by carriage or wagon from the nearest railroad town, Winslow. Contrasted with the bright velvets of the heavily jeweled Navajo women and colored head shawls of the Hopi, the dress of the 4 or 5 white women was conspicuous by its very conservatism. Prim shirtwaists, stiffly starched and high-collared, high-buttoned shoes, and long skirts which swept the ground. Further emphasizing their own tribal apartment from their bareheaded Navajo sisters, the white women sought protection from the hot sun under big black umbrellas. In this high wind-swept setting, the umbrellas bobbed about, drab accents in a scene otherwise drenched in color. When the sunlight faded from the rooftop of Tom Polke's house, Richard and his companions were among the first to be aware that something strange was happening. Sounds came from the Mesa trail, indicating the villagers were about to be attacked in force. A curious crowd gathered. Out of the darkness emerged the forms of a weird procession. A milling cluster of Hopi men, staggering under their burden, were toiling up the steep path, bearing on their shoulders a long ladder taken from some adobe dwelling. Riding in the center of the ladder, maintaining an uncertain balance, was the figure of a very large person who was interspersing alarmed imprecations with sharp commands. Someone in the raiding crowd seized a torch, and in its flaring light the caravan struggling upward sprang into bright relief in the darkness. "Easy now, careful!" cried the figure on the ladder. "Don't let me fall, damn it all!" The angry voice was a woman's. Fascinated by the spectacle, Bert Cowing wrote in his journal of all the commotion, was found to be nothing more or less than a certain Miss Lowe, who weighed well on toward 250 pounds and was short and square, being carried up by about 16 natives. She was, it turned out, a rather well-known newspaper writer. Standing off to one side of the rooftop watching, Richard smiled and afterward remembered Miss Lowe. There was a logic in the manner of her conveyance that appealed strongly to him. As he described the scene later, only his eyes betrayed amusement. It was inevitable, because she was so heavy, there just wasn't any other way for her to get up that steep trail. On one of these 3 days on First Mesa, Richard met Dr. Jesse Walter Fuchs of the Smithsonian, who the year before had published a report on the snake dance ceremonies of Walpi in 1891 and 1893. Bert Cowing only recorded the 2 men met, making no note of their conversation. Evidently the counter made no particular impression on Richard, as it might have, had he known how Fuchs would later refer to his work in Mesa Verde. Instead, his attention centered on the color and life of the Pueblo and the ritual upon which the Hopi placed so much dependence for rain. Like every Indian Pueblo, Walpi had its share of dogs. These animals had one remarkable trait, or at least so it seemed to Richard. If they were below and wanted to go up, the ladders by which the Hopi climbed to the 2nd and 3rd terraces of their village were no barrier. The dogs negotiated them up or down in one mad scramble. Another aspect in the Mesa dwellers, which Bert Cowing observed, was the custom the Hopi sometimes used to punish burros that wandered astray. A great number of burros, he wrote, had their ears clipped or entirely cut off. We learned that there was a law that a burro found in the cornfield was entitled to have its ear clipped for the first offense, the other one clipped for the second, the first one entirely cut off for the third, and etc. When the ears give out, they hunt down the owner and make him pay for damages. I guess it doesn't hurt the burros much. Probably lessens their values. The owner is punished as well as the burros. Richard's keenest interest was in discovering similarities between the arts and crafts of these Hopi and those left behind by the ANASAZI of Mesa, Verde, and Chaco Canyon. The stonemasons of the Hopi were definitely less skilled or more careless as potters. Most of them were inferior, but as weavers and farmers they were probably more than equal to the old people of Kiet. However, more important, Richard remarked to Clayton and Dr. Pruden, was the astonishingly close relationship in craft and customs between these modern mesa dwellers and the ancient cliff dwellers.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm. Get me to the farm. Get me to the farm.